Hello, we're going to be in Exodus 18 today. This is about Jethro. This guy goes by a bunch of names, I want to tell you. This is Moses' father-in-law. This is an extremely interesting chapter, and it's caused a great deal of discussion because of the different ways this man is introduced and how he impacts Moses. So let's look at it, could we? Now, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and notice, if you would, this guy is called Hobab, Hobab, in book of Numbers. I believe it's 10:29 and Judges 4:11. He's also called Ruel in this number, son of Ruel, and some say, well, he's called Ruel in Exodus 2:18, called son of Ruel in Numbers 10, and he's also the name spelled differently. Instead of Jethro, it's Jether in Exodus 4:18. Well, it seems to be different titles for this man. Maybe he is the son of Ruel, and that would explain one of them. Exactly what Hobab and Jether and Jethro are, we're just not sure. Some say it's the titles he possessed. Now, he was a priest of Midian. This construction elsewhere refers to the high priest of Israel. So was he the high priest of Midian, or was he simply the priest in the sense that Abraham and Job were priests of their family, being the oldest living member that loved and believed in God? I'm not sure. Now, Midian, the Midianites, we learn from other passages that the Midianites were related to the Kenites. Now, the Kenites are in the line of the covenant people. And some say that Moses learned about God from Jethro, not back home from his parents, but from Jethro, that Jethro is the one that kept the holy mountain and kept the covenant of Yahweh together. And the reason they say that, in this chapter, Jethro is going to offer a sacrifice to Yahweh. Jethro is going to talk in characteristic Yahwistic terms. Jethro is going to give Moses a piece of advice in God's name, and Moses is going to take it. All of that has led many to believe that Jethro was either rabbis say he was a convert to Judaism. Some other scholars say, no, he is one who preserved the Yahwistic traditions. But as we get into it, I think we'll see that although I think he knew of Yahweh from living with Moses 40 years, I just can't hold to the Kenite theory personally. Moses' father-in-law heard it that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Now notice in verse 1, you see the word God, capital G, and the word Lord with all caps. These are two primary Hebrew terms, Elohim for God, and Yahweh, translated Lord. Now there is the theory among scholars that the Pentateuch is put together by 5 different sets of authors. Those who call God Elohim, those who call God Yahweh, the book of Deuteronomy, and the priestly source. But it's obvious here that and God is the word for source E, and Yahweh is the source J. It's obvious it's the same author here. You can't split this sentence in two and say 2 authors wrote this sentence. Throughout this chapter, it kind of moves between Yahweh and Elohim. And I think we've done a disservice to the Bible in trying to analyze all the forms and sources. A good book on this would be Josh McDowell's More Evidence That Demands a Verdict, Volume 2, that deals with this theory that I think is in error. Notice it mentions then this brought Israel out of Egypt, and of course we mean the sons of Israel, the descendants of Jacob, the covenant people. Notice it says, and Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Moses' wife Zipporah. Now Zipporah is a little bird. Some think a wobbler. Some think she walked funny, but I prefer just to say maybe she talked like a little bird, or just got it as a name as a child. I don't know. After he had sent her away. Now that's unusual because we hear of her in Exodus 4 verse 20, and they're on their way to Egypt, Moses, his wife, and his child. And this is that strange little account about the angel of the Lord trying to kill Moses because the son wasn't circumcised, and Zipporah circumcises the son and throws the foreskin at Moses' feet and says, I have a bloody husband. Oh, it's a strange account. Some say after this that Moses sent her home with her son back to her father. I'm not sure. It seems to me the author's kind of picking up the trail here, and last time we see she was going with Moses. The rabbis say that Aaron talked to him and said, why are you bringing her? Don't we have enough trouble in Egypt? Isn't there enough God's people down there? Send her home. and Moses did. Now, for whatever reason, we find them being reunited here. Matter of fact, even in this account, look in verse 4, we find another son had been born since chapter 4, verse 20, that we didn't know about. Isn't it funny? This other son, Eleazar, is not mentioned anywhere else in the Scriptures. He's not developed or picked up on or told anything about. And that shows the history of this account. That someone's mentioned, never mentioned again, shows that we're into there's no reason to make that up, right? If it's some kind of made-up tale, you wouldn't include somebody you don't develop. So it's a good way of showing the historicity of this account. Let's see. And her two sons, one was who is named Gershom. That means sojourner or stranger. At the time of his first child, Moses was still kind of cringing under his rejection from Egypt, being chased out by apparently the tattletale-ness of his own people he was trying to help. But this second son, which means El is my help, a little more faith's involved here. Maybe Moses' faith is returning to him as he sees that God's going to be with him and help him, and his people too. The God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. I get so tickled the Jews. They say that when Pharaoh tried to kill Moses, Moses' neck turned as hard as marble, so Pharaoh's sword couldn't cut off his head. Well, I don't think that's true. I think that's why Moses fled. Pharaoh's sword could cut off his head. But notice here the popular etymology of the son. Now, most of the Hebrew names are not technical etymologies, but the popular etymology, usually based on sound. Notice it says, Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was camped at the Mount of God. Now, this, of course, is Mount Sinai, which is not a Hebrew name. We think it gets its name possibly from the area it was located in, the wilderness of sin. Now, sin does not have anything to do with sin like committing sin, spiritual rebellion. It's a word that seemed to refer to the type of soil. Some say it was a clay kind of soil. Others say no, it refers to the type of vegetation, a low bush in the area. We're not sure exactly, but it seems to relate to the word Sinai and sin. Now, the Hebrew designation for this is Horeb. Been much discussion. Is Sinai the mountain and Horeb the mountain range, or vice versa? We're just not sure. Matter of fact, we're not sure where this mountain is. As big as this giving of the Ten Commandments is, the Jews didn't really care where this was. They were more interested in the Promised Land than they were where Mount Sinai is. Notice it mentions here then, and he went and sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law, Jethro, am coming to you, and your wife and your two sons with you. And Moses went out to meet his father-in-law. Now, this idea of Moses going out to meet them has bothered a lot of folks, because here's Moses, the called representative and spokesman for God. And watch what he's going to do. He bowed down and kissed him. And each other asked their welfare and went into the tent. Boy, that has bothered the Jews bad. But really, this is more of the traditional Oriental greeting than it is any kind of theological ascent of a greater to a lesser or vice versa. It's just the typical Oriental greeting. Moses was glad to see him, and it was just that kind of honor. This passage has been used so many different ways. Some say that Jethro, being a pagan, the Gentiles are included in those welcome to the covenant. That's basically been Christian interpretation. Others say no, this is the way of talking about the new covenant that God's going to bring. Notice it says the source of Yahwehism. Some think the Kenite theory came that this man was Moses' teacher about who Yahweh is. Others say use this as a relationship between church and state, that Jethro had a good idea about how to do things, and many times good ideas are not inspired of God, but the people of God can use them, and that's how the state works with the faith. Others have said, no, it's the idea of the gospel for Gentiles. Well, my word, they're building a whole lot on this one little chapter about Moses' father-in-law, of who we know so little. And that's really characteristic of our interpretation at some point. We want so badly to hear what God says about our situation, our day. How do we do life? How do we please God? That sometimes we read far much more into these ancient accounts than they were ever meant to do. Now, I grant you from 1 Corinthians 10 that all Scripture is for us. But we need to be careful in making it go too far beyond what it originally meant to say. So they greet each other and they go into the tent. And apparently it was Jethro's tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and all the hardships that had befallen them on the journey, and how the Lord had delivered them. This is like Moses' testimony time to his father-in-law. I'm sure many nights they'd sat around the campfire and talked about the things of God. This is a wonderful time. This is not a development of liturgy. This is not some kind of formal thing. It's kind of Moses sharing. And look what Jethro does. Jethro rejoiced over all the goodness which the Lord had done to Israel in delivering them from the hand of the Egyptians. Wow. And now verses 9 and 10 are going to contain several characteristic Yahwistic worship terms that are going to be given as if just what Jethro said. Look at verse 10. And Jethro said, "Bless the Lord who delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians, from the hand of Pharaoh, who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know the Lord is greater than all the gods. Indeed, it is proven when they dealt proudly against the people." Oh my, what a statement. Boys, this is a lot of interpretations here. It seems to imply not that he's beginning a new faith. That's what the rabbis say. This was his public profession of faith. This was him becoming a proselyte, the Jews say. But it seems in context that he is just adding faith to an already existing faith. Kind of like we studied last week, God did several things to test his children to build their faith. This seems like one of those things when this man heard about it, it brought to memory the things that God had done, was doing, and he was thrilled to death. He was encouraged. It encouraged his faith. So I don't think this is initial faith. But boy, it is a tremendous statement. It's not exactly an affirmation of monotheism. Now, when I use the word monotheism, mono meaning only, and theism meaning concerning God, there's another word I think we ought to use. Now, you've heard of poly, which means many theism, many gods, but there's one more, henotheism. This is at least implying, minimally, that as far as Jethro was concerned, Yahweh was the only God for him and his family. We call that henotheism. It's not saying no other gods exist, but it's saying for me and mine, this is the only God we're going to follow. Now that seems to be what Jethro is affirming. Now this is an idiom, the Lord is greater than all the other gods. We find it in Psalms 135, verse 5. And so it's more of an idiom about this is the main God for me. I don't think we're going to get into full philosophical, ontological monotheism, at least clearly stated until the 8th century prophets, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah. But there are certainly allusions to it in Moses and before that. Now, notice if you would, where it mentions here, and Moses, verse 12. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, he's going to do two things here. He took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law before the Lord. Now this seems to be almost like an official covenant being made. You know that dinners were a special sign of friendship and fidelity, and they sealed covenants. Now is it saying he took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God? Does that mean he brought it to Aaron and Aaron offered it? Or the traditional implication being he offered the sacrifices himself to God. Now which it is, I'm not sure. But it's obviously a very special covenant meal where this man and Moses and the people of God are making a kind of a peace pact, if you please. The elders are there representing the tribe. Aaron's there representing the Lord as far as the priest. And Moses is there as the prophet and speaker. I think it's very, very interesting here, this. And it came about the next day that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood about Moses from morning to evening. Now, this special night compact, Jethro was about to leave, but he stayed over and was kind of watching what happened. It seems to imply that it was by accident, not something was planned. Now, this Moses sat and the people stood. These are two legal technical terms. Moses sitting, they standing. They stood all day. Moses was tired because of the amount. They were tired from standing. Jethro saw this, and now Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people and said, "What is this thing you were doing for the people?" Now he knew it's just a way of getting in the question. "Why do you alone sit as judge on all this people stand about you from morning till evening?" And Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God." Now this inquire of God later became a technical term for coming to the high priest for him to take the Urim and Thummim in the pouch behind the breastplate, the ephod, or to inquire about legal matters about how does the law apply to this. Now notice at this point the Ten Commandments have not been given. This would be asking direct revelation of God. Some say this is how the Ten Commandments developed, these judging sessions, and Moses expanded them in the the Ten Commandments is coming up in the next chapter or so. That's possible, but I don't think we know exactly what happened here. Notice there is no distinction between the secular and the sacred. Only we do that in our modern interpretation of the Bible. The Jews saw all of life belong to God. Now, isn't it interesting here that Moses is acting more like a priest than a prophet here? Now, he is called a prophet in Deuteronomy 18. There's one like unto him going to come after him, a prophet. But Moses is also of the tribe of Levi. He's a priest. Now, the priest had three basic functions. Number one was to approach God on behalf of men. That's their sacrificial cultic sense. The other was they were to teach people the ways of God. And number three, they were to act as judges in legal decisions. Now here Moses acting in the idea of a judge. Down in verse 20, he's going to be acting as a teacher. He's to teach the Word of God to these elders and let them act as judges. Now this is going to set the stage for the judicial pattern of Israel. And some say it's appalling that Jethro ought to be the one to think of this. And this is where they develop all this church-state philosophy, and I think they read way too much in here. I think Moses was a teachable man. This made sense to him. And Jethro couches it in terms, if this would be God's will, you ought to do it. So Jethro was oriental enough to leave it to be Moses' choice and not pressure him. And I just see here Moses saying, hey, that's a good idea, fella. Now, God could have told Moses directly, but God often chooses to use human instrumentality, and here he uses Jethro. When they have a dispute, and it comes to me, I judge between a man and his neighbor to make known the statutes of gods and laws. And Moses' father-in-law said to him, this thing you are doing is not good. I think we ought to talk a minute about religious messianic complexes. Sometimes the religious leader thinks, oh, if I'm not here, nothing really good for God can happen. If I'm not here, nothing really spiritual can happen. Folks, many of our faults in our religious leaders come from them trying to do too much, trying to answer every question themselves, trying to be the focal point of every decision. We need to share the labor of doing the will of God. That's what this is teaching us. We ought to have elders to help make the decisions. We ought to have people help do ministry. Now this blesses the one who delegates the responsibility because he lives longer, doesn't get ulcers. It blesses those who share in the responsibility, the elders and the leaders, because they have a part in the work of God. And it blesses those who are waiting for a decision or waiting for guidance because they don't have to wait and wait and wait. You know, if you look through the history of Israel, there's been a lot of problems connected with this. Just think about how one of David's sons rebelled against him because David tried to judge all the people. And while they were waiting in line, this son kind of said, well, boy, if I was king, I wouldn't make you wait this long. So this is a problem. It's going to be more of one. Notice it says, and you will surely wear out. The word here is to fade away like a leaf dropping off a tree and falling down. You can wear yourself. I know people who just, they spend all their time at church. Their families go to pot because they spend so much time with doing the things of God. That's what happened to Eli. That's what happened to Samuel. That's what happened to David. Folks, be careful. Delegate some responsibility. You're just not that crucial. God can make it without you. I know that's a radical statement, but He can. We need to develop our spiritual gift and our priority and let others develop and use theirs. Now listen to me, and I shall give you counsel, and God be with you. You be to the people's representative before God, and you bring the disputes to God. Then teach them the statutes, the laws, and make them known to them the way in which they are to walk, and the work they are to do. Now here's the teaching ministry. This is very similar to what we find in the pastoral epistles. Find some trustworthy men and teach them the things of God to pass on to others. This is just the principle of delegation. And I sure think it's very important that we spend time. This is the same kind of thing in the life of Jesus, that He poured His life into 12 men. Now people like the Navigators have really picked up on this, and discipleship groups, and I think it's very valid and very helpful. We can't do it all ourselves. Furthermore, you shall select out from the people able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain, and you shall place them over them as leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. Notice the qualification for these men is basically spiritual, not judicial, spiritual. This sounds very much like Acts 6, the choosing of probably the early deacons. We're not sure about that. It doesn't mention the word deacon there. Notice they're to fear God, a reverence toward God. They're to be men of truth. Now, this word truth can mean truth versus error, but in the Old Testament it primarily means trustworthiness. They need to be a faithful, dependable men who fear God. And notice they're not going to take bribes. They're not going to. They're going to hate dishonest gain. They're going to be honest and not be able to be bought off. And then notice the thousands, hundreds, and fifties and tens. Now, this basically is a military structure. And of course, the Hebrew children coming out of Egypt have just begun to develop their own military sense and have to protect themselves. So this is very common. Now, this is a good place where some of these Hebrew words are very ambiguous. Some of them can mean clan or family or a group of 1,000. We're just not sure about a lot of the numbers and a lot of the translation of these Hebrew words in the Old Testament. That's why I think some verses are just untranslatable for us because we're not sure of the etymology of these words. We don't have a lot of Hebrew outside the Bible, and so it's hard to corroborate the true meaning of these terms. But it's obviously a military emphasis. I got tickled at the Sanhedrin, one of the tractates of the Talmud, 19a. They figured up all the different people who were in the Exodus. They went to Exodus 12:37 and said there was 78,600 judges that Moses appointed. I mean, we're talking about 1.5 million people. Can you imagine how many would want to have cases in 1.5 million people? Boy. Now notice, if you would, that, let's see, verse 23. And if you do this thing, and God so commands you. Now here is that idea. It's an idiom of theological insight. He's saying, I hope God's going to lead you, and I think God's going to lead you, but Moses, you're the one that's got to decide ultimately. It's a way of letting Moses keep face. Jethro's idea, but Moses is going to incorporate it, and hopefully God's going to speak to Moses. But isn't it interesting that God spoke to Moses through human instrumentality? I think that's the way God speaks to us. I think God can speak through any situation. Now, is this God speaking through a pagan? I don't really think Jethro's a pagan. I don't think he's a total unbeliever. You can't read verses 9, 10, and 11 and come across with Jethro being a pagan. You say, is he a brand new believer? I don't think that either. This is tremendous insight from a new person, but really this is just common horse sense. This is not theological insight, it's common horse sense. And I think we ought to think about that. One of the ways that I think you can tell the will of God, and one of the ways that I think you can know your spiritual gift, is by asking those who know you well, who are spiritually mature and walk with God, what they see in your life. When you ask them what they see in your life, they're going to tell you the strengths they see. And probably your spiritual gift and the direction the Lord's going to lead you in life is connected to that. So I think taking godly advice from those who we know love the Lord is just helpful. We ought to think about that. It's one of that principle comes from a little book called Affirming the Will of God by Paul Little. It's an InterVarsity Press booklet. It's the best book I've ever read on how do you know God's will and how do you know what your spiritual gift is. If you're interested in that, you ought to get that little booklet. And Moses listened to his father-in-law and did all that he said. And Moses chose able men out of all Israel and made them heads of the people, leaders of thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens. Now, most of these would be elders. Now, the concept of elders in the church or deacons came from the synagogue, their use of elders. And that came from this use here in Moses. This is the beginning of choosing of elders. Now, elders doesn't necessarily imply you have to be an older man, but it's assumed that the longer you live, the more wise you would be. And there were already elders in each of these tribal units. So it's just a very smart way of making the tribes feel a part of the system, letting these older men have a place of honor, sharing the responsibility, teaching about the Lord. It's a way of communicating God's truth out in a concentric circle fashion to the 1.5 million plus people. I just think it's a very wise thing. And they judged the people at all times. The difficult disputes they would bring to Moses, but the minor disputes they themselves would judge. And Moses bade his father-in-law farewell, and he went his way to his own land. Now, exactly where his land is, I'm not sure. One of the problems of the location of Mount Sinai is we don't know where Midian is. Midian seems to be one of those groups of pastoral people that moved from southern Sinai over into the Arabia, Moab, Edom, those kind of areas, and back. So we're not exactly sure where Jethro went. But it's close enough that it doesn't cause any problems. I think as we look at these kind of historical accounts of all that's happening to Moses, there is an undercurrent of religious truth that's applicable to our lives. But I would say to you again, be careful when drawing applications that the applications you draw wouldn't surprise Moses. If it surprises Moses, it probably surprises God. We desperately want a word from God, but be careful about not reading too much of your own presuppositions, your own experience, your own theological background into this passage, or try to back up what you do based on an Old Testament passage. Be much better to go to the New Testament teaching passages for our church polity than try to lock it back here into Moses. I think the church has been guilty of trying to build too much theology. Example, church and state relations built on this. I think that's making this chapter carry much more theological weight than it was ever meant to carry. Of course, the same is true of Jesus and the coin about Caesar. We make it carry much more theological weight than it was ever meant to. Well, be careful. Read it in context. Get the big picture of what God's doing, leading these people a little bit at a time, kind of like their spiritual kindergarten, to a place to trust Him, giving them information as they can take it, and expecting them to walk in it. Well, I've really enjoyed being with you, and I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. God bless you.